Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. In keeping with games that are similar to Nintendo products which I can't actually play without getting Content ID flagged, let's explore the sequel to a game I quite liked as a child, Shining Force 2. Shining Force holds an interesting place in my heart. When I was younger, my family got a bunch of old Sonic games that had been ported to PC, which included the second Sega Smash Pack. There were very few games in it that we played, but even though I couldn't tell you the name of it back then, Shining Force ended up being the exception. A game I played more than the 4 Sonic games we got, even after accounting for relative game length. I always say that Diablo was the game which really solidified what I enjoy most in a video game, but in many ways Shining Force was the precursor to that. Even after I'd forgotten about the game, I still trended towards that style of gameplay, as while we had a Game Boy in the house, I played a lot of Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. And yet, going back to it now was interesting to say the least. The game was one of the first SRPGs, which are strangely called simulation RPGs in Japan, but which I always thought meant strategy RPG. Ah well, odd naming conventions aside, it's somewhat unclear whether Fire Emblem or Shining Force really made the genre into what it is, but both were quite different from their Japanese RPG roots, taking the core gameplay of a JRPG and translating it onto a 2D grid, meaning there were a lot more units to keep track of, and we now had to keep track of where they were positioned on a map. I went into the original Shining Force hoping to fall in love with it again, but looking at it now, it doesn't hold up as well as I expected. Perhaps it's because I have played better games since, but it was easy to notice the technical limitations of the day without even going into how, well, basic everything was. Because of that, I went into the sequel more than a little concerned. Was there enough time for them to fix up the issues I had with the original, or was this going to be another disappointing delve into part of my gaming past that was best left ignored? So, without further ado, let's find out. Since the story doesn't receive as much attention as the rest of the game, let's start there. You are the canonically named Bowie, a youngster growing up in the town of Grand Seal under the tutelage of a wise old wizard named Astral. The day we meet Bowie and his friends is a day that started like any other, but instead of the usual lessons from Astral, he is called away to the palace in order to attend to the king. Being the rambunctious youngsters you are, you decide to follow him, hoping to both meet the princess and figure out what's going on. Unbeknownst to anyone in Grand Seal, or the island of Grands at large, is that a Robin Hood-like thief named Slade had slipped into an ancient temple and stolen 2 powerful gems, which just so happened to have been sealing away an ancient evil locked away near Grand Seal, because of course they were. So naturally, you end up on an adventure as you try to discover what happened, deal with the consequences of what follows, and then figure out how to deal with the evil that has been unwittingly released. That's about all I can say without entering spoiler territory, and even for what I said, it might have been too much, simply because there is a lot that happens within the first 2 hours. Despite all that happens though, it doesn't feel like too much because it's really well paced, with enough information to keep us interested without giving away too much. The characters you interact with are also really engaging within that first section, as while there are plenty of characters to keep track of, there's just enough time for each of them that you can get a sense of their personality. I especially like how Astral is handled, because while he does play as the mentor figure, he isn't constrained by that archetype. He's allowed to be unsure and indecisive when he's out of his element, he's allowed to be emotional when he's faced with something he's excited about or in awe of, and when he wants something done, he knows how to be forceful. He's probably the most well-defined character in the game, even more so than Bowie. And outside of a phoenix named Peter that you meet later on, Astral might be my favorite character. The ending is also handled really well. As well as a typical fantasy ending of defeating the evil entity and getting the girl, as if that's even a spoiler worth hiding, there were a couple of moments that genuinely took me by surprise and were handled really well. I don't want to divulge too much in this video as there's not enough to warrant a spoiler section, but I will say that the manner in which some of the characters behaved was cleverly handled. The ending itself was a little sappy for my liking, though that might be because I wanted Bowie to get together with a different girl, but the fact that I felt that way is tribute to my investment in the outcome. Unfortunately, something that I'll be repeating throughout this video is that while the first and third acts were really well done, had a lot of great moments, and were engaging throughout, the middle of the game is the weakest part. The pacing slows down more than it should, the characters aren't nearly as well fleshed out, and there's a lot more downtime in between the standout moments. To some degree though, it's due to an issue the game has with its premise. As a turn-based strategy game, it has to introduce a fair number of characters so that we have some strategic options for the gameplay segments. But because it has to introduce so many, there's never enough time to really get to know the characters outside of a core set, namely Peter, Astral, and Bowie. Some of the characters are fairly involved with the plot at certain points, but outside of that are shunted aside to focus on the main cast. Not even Bowie's childhood friends are immune to that rule, as after a certain point we basically don't hear from them until after the game is over. They're still involved in the Shining Force we're cultivating, but they just don't get any lines or comments on, well, anything that's going on. It's no wonder games like Fire Emblem have included a support system so that we can get to know more about our team. As without that, there just isn't much to each individual outside of their sprite art and maybe a short reason as to why they're joining you. Even then, however, there's not even all that much emphasis placed on Bowie as the main character. For the most part, he has a case of the silent protagonist, except when he doesn't. There's clearly a personality and charisma that his friends find compelling enough to follow his lead, and for powerful entities later in the game to recognize him as important to upcoming events. But the problem is, we don't get to know him all that well. He gets some moments to be awesome, but outside of that, he seems to exist for us to take the role of and insert our own dialogue into. Unfortunately, that idea falls apart when you give him a line of dialogue here and there, especially since the lines he does have don't give us much to work with. What makes it really frustrating is that there are moments where other characters react as if he did say something when we don't get to see what that thing was. Somehow this game made me care about an old man and a bird more than the lead character whom everyone loves and follows, which is a sentence I never thought I would say and which I'll never be able to take back. Good job, Shining Force 2, you suck. So before I get booed off the internet for that comment, let's keep up the theme of stuff I liked matched with stuff I dislike, continuing with the world building. On the surface, it looks like generic fantasy, with a large mix of various fantasy creatures as well as the usual human population. And yet something that I noticed when replaying the original Shining Force is that there's this weird sci-fi aspect that doesn't get a lot of attention. We know that there was this group called the Ancients who had what could only be described as advanced technology, including robots that function almost to the level of humans, as well as tons of other inventions that we don't see a lot of but are still a factor towards the end. It's something that doesn't go unmentioned in Shining Force 2, and though it's not all that well explored, it's an interesting Shannara series premise that makes me want to play more games in this franchise just to learn more. Even if we don't get to know too much of the world, I really like the way it's presented. They were limited in what they could show, as the sprite art does hamstring them to some extent, but they managed to get a lot of emotion out of what range they had. It's surprisingly charming in its simplicity, with the sprite art doing a lot to make each character distinct to where I want to know more, even if I don't always get what I want. The music is also really well done, which kind of took me by surprise. When I played through the original Shining Force, it felt like it was trying to go for an epic fantasy feel to make everything seem more important, but outside of a couple of tracks, ended up sounding abrasive instead. Here though, I think the composer truly found his stride, as the music accentuated the emotional moments really well, and was really catchy on top of that. I'm not sure I would put it quite on the same level as Diablo or Undertale, but it's one of those rare soundtracks where when it gets stuck in my head, I'm not desperate to get it out. To be fair, part of my enjoyment might also be because I found an official orchestral version, which meant I had a reference point for what the composer had in mind. Even without that reference though, it works well within its limitations and does well despite them. So when all is said and done, the story, characters, and world have a decent number of problems, but when push comes to shove, I did enjoy my time with them, and I did want to see how the story was going to wrap itself up. In many ways, that's the same opinion that I have of the gameplay, so let's take a look at what it has to offer. At its core, it's a turn-based strategy game, where you and your opponent have a set team of characters. Your goal is to kill the opponent's boss character, be they an actual boss or some random enemy unit, before they take down Bowie. The most interesting part to me, and what leads to the most interesting strategic options, pertains to turn order, as instead of giving you a turn and then the enemy a turn, each individual character has an agility statistic which determines when they move. There's a bit of weirdness when it comes to turn order, as there seems to be an element of randomness at play, but after a few rounds you should get a good feel for how it works. There are also a number of other stats to keep track of, all of which are self-explanatory if you've played an RPG in the last few years. Attack determines how hard you hit, defense determines how much of a physical attack doesn't apply, hit points and mana/magic points show how many hits you can take or spells you can cast, and movement determines how many squares a character can move before taking another action. What makes this interesting is that defense doesn't affect magical attacks, but said magic tends not to have as much scalability unless you use a greater level spell, which uses more magic, creating a nice bit of resource management beyond just your characters and their health. Where this management aspect really kicks in is with your healing characters, who only have oh so many healing spells they can use by virtue of their limited magic. This is especially the case in earlier levels when you only have one healing character, meaning you need to be much more careful as to who you send to the front. There's also a chance for one or more special attacks to occur, which includes double attacks, critical strikes, dodging, or counterattacks, adding a bit of randomness in to add some tension without completely overshadowing the strategic aspect. In order to continue doing well, each character levels up based on the damage they've dealt, as well as what other spells they may have cast, with more experience being awarded for more characters affected, more damage dealt, or for dealing the killing blow. When a character reaches level 20, they can also be promoted, which resets their level back to 1 but also preserves their current stats, allowing them to level up faster in the future and use more powerful weapons that you find or purchase. Typically though, you won't want to promote them as soon as they hit 20, as it will help make later battles easier if you can afford to. For me, I was able to do just fine leveling most of my characters to about 30, though even then I think it might have been okay if I had promoted at level 25. I've heard mixed opinions online as to when you should and shouldn't do so, but for what I played, I didn't have an issue. For the most part, it's a very basic system, but one that I quite like. The way that turn order is handled means that I can't simply create a wall of units and then slam it into the enemy formation, which would be a little too easy. Inevitably, there's going to be a gap in the front line, and that's something I have to be aware of since characters that use ranged weapons or magic tend to not have as much defense as their melee counterparts. More importantly, since that I can't determine the order in which every unit will move, at least not easily, I need to be even more careful when considering whether, if I send this character out there, is it to line up a good attack or as a sacrificial lamb. Even then though, I also have to factor in the AI, as it tends to prioritize characters that have lower defense, with harder difficulties showing no mercy if they can deal a killing blow. Admittedly though, the penalty for a character dying isn't all that severe. Every time you take down an enemy, you gain a small amount of gold that is usually more than enough to pay for reviving anyone that goes down, and then with plenty left over to buy weapons and healing items. The only sizable penalty occurs when Bowie goes down, which instantly ends the fight and causes you to lose half of your gold, which can be annoying if you've built up a sizable stockpile. In hindsight, that might be why they give overall more gold than you would lose from reviving characters, just in case you do mess up that badly. Even then though, if Bowie does go down or you run away, when you get back to that area, you basically start over again as if nothing happened, with all of the experience and gold you earned from trying that fight before. It does take away some of the stakes, but given the time spent in each battle, having to start over is usually punishment enough. Even if that's annoying to you though, that setup also acts as a band-aid to what I see as a fundamental problem with the core gameplay of not just this game, but maybe even the SRPG genre as a whole. And now that I've said that, I've undoubtedly raised some eyebrows, but before we get out the pitchforks and fire spells, let me explain. My concern is that the RPG part of this game is simultaneously the genre's greatest strength and weakness. In terms of story, it theoretically allows for more to be done with characters that otherwise might not get all that much attention if this were purely a strategy game. In terms of gameplay, however, there is a very severe disconnect between the actions you take to win a battle and the reward system. Think about what the goal of a turn-based strategy game is. Your aim is to defeat the enemy as efficiently as possible, which means keeping as many of your units alive to create as big of an advantage as possible. If you do this successfully, you'll find yourself with more resources and eventually overpower your opponent. In a game with a limited unit pool, that means staying closely grouped, finding one enemy unit to kill as quickly as possible, and then moving on to the next. However, the way experience is handled means that characters are rewarded for dealing more damage and or the killing blow to opponents, something that your optimal strategy isn't always able to take into account. That means if you abide by standard practice for turn-based strategy games, you're inevitably going to have a level disparity. That on its own isn't necessarily a problem, but because of how the turn order and leveling is handled, literally any disparity that emerges is going to result in a rich-get-richer scenario, where the units who are doing more are going to attack first, stay in fights longer, defeat more enemies, and be overall more useful, while those who don't have that extra power are going to find themselves trying to get in position to do something, only to find that either everything is dead, or they themselves are dead once a monster breathes on them wrong. And then once that happens, suddenly your power curve and difficulty curve are completely out of whack. This might seem like an exaggeration, but even if you go out of your way to leave enemies alive so that lower level units can take the kill, the nature of the game and the small amount of randomness involved means that even if you do a ton of grinding, it's impossible to avoid a power disparity, which means you'll end up with characters that are simply not worth using because they're not worth investing time into. I know some people might say that it adds another layer of strategy, as it ends up giving us a secondary objective throughout the game, but where this game is concerned, it doesn't necessarily add another strategic avenue when there's so little information displayed on the screen at once. The only thing it adds is unnecessary time spent, regardless of whether you decide to be super careful or blindly charge forth and deal with the consequences later. Even then, I could maybe accept that this is okay if the grinding required to make up for this fact wasn't listed next to boredom in the dictionary. The reason why I didn't like the middle section has less to do with the actual plot or characters, and everything to do with the fact that there is a ton of combat to get through just so that we can get to what little plot there is. We end up going from a short battle between story segments at the start to at least one or two relatively lengthy battles between those story bits, assuming we can even figure out where we're supposed to go because apparently the technology wasn't there yet for clear objective markers in a map that gives the appearance of a more open world. And don't even get me started on when you have to engage in the grind on top of those longer fights. Before it is said, however, I know that a lot of people who enjoy JRPGs and SRPGs don't mind the elements of grinding, and in some cases openly welcome it. For me personally, I'm not inherently against the idea of grinding, as my love of Diablo-style games can attest to. However, for me to be okay with the grinding section, one of two things have to be addressed. Either the reason for doing so has to be compelling, or the core gameplay has to be good enough to where I don't mind doing it. Shining Force 2 does not satisfy either of those. I'm not grinding on a quest for bigger shoulder pads. I'm doing it to increase an arbitrary number a little bit more. I'm not doing it because it's fun, I'm doing it because I hit a difficulty spike and would like to actually get on with my life. I think the reason why I'm focusing on this so much is that while it didn't dampen things too much through the really well done beginning and ending sections, the grinding required to get to that end made the technical problems with the game much more noticeable. It takes a long time to cycle through turns, which is even more annoying when some of the enemy won't even move from their spot until your army crosses a certain line. Our inability to see health bars without selecting a character makes it difficult to plan out a formation because you're having to work based on intuition and memory rather than ingenuity. Even if we were to indulge the idea that experience management equals strategy, which I don't agree with, that would be all well and good if I actually had a clear indicator as to who was going to be moving next. Unless you're really good at memorizing that crap, which Occam's Razor states is a terrible idea when the lack of permadeath means that you can be relatively bullheaded. All of those issues were present throughout, but since the pacing was better towards the first and third act, I didn't care. But when the middle section came around, I ended up not playing the game for months because it had turned into a slog, to where I felt the need to play through a second time on the hardest difficulty just to ensure that the issues I had weren't just a matter of starting the game almost a year ago. To the game's credit though, all of these issues weren't as bad as I expected on the second time around, even though all of the monsters had a flat 25% stat boost. What extra grinding and nuisance was present ended up being more than made up for by the increased challenge. Speaking of harder difficulties, the way the game handles them is a little weird. Normal mode is what I started out with, since in old school gaming, harder difficulty levels tend to be an Admiral Akbar meme waiting to happen. But when I did go through normal mode, it wasn't too challenging outside of the final confrontation and a few difficulty spikes. Hell, the first battle might actually be one of the toughest, simply because you only have 3 characters against 6 and one of those happens to be a healer. Hard and ouch difficulty adds smarter AI and a greater likelihood of random effects like critical strike happening in the enemy's favor. For the most part though, they were still fairly easy to deal with during the small amount I played of them, with the technically third hardest difficulty, namely super difficulty, actually being the hardest because of the 25% stat boost. That's the difficulty I finished the game on, and man was it both rewarding by virtue of its challenge, but also tedious because of the extra grinding that seemed to be required. According to the client I used and the footage I recorded, it took me about 4 more hours than my normal run to beat the game, which given the circumstances seems fairly reasonable, but not something I'd recommend you attempt on the first try, unless you know what you're doing. Overall, I'm really torn as to how to recommend this. On one hand, the pacing, story, and gameplay were both really well set up and executed in the first and third acts. Though there wasn't much that was super spectacular save for a few clever ideas, it was good enough to where I wanted to see what would happen next. On the other hand, I spent a large chunk of this review ranting solely about one system that made me doubt the integrity of the strategy RPG genre as a whole, to say nothing about the underutilized characters, underutilized world, and a tedious middle section that made all of my criticisms come into sharp focus. Part of me wants to recommend this game because of the solid execution and really good moments, while another part of me wants to set my computer on fire for how long it took to finally get through it. In the end though, I think it comes down to 2 questions. Did I have fun with the game, and if so, did the enjoyment I get out of it overshadow the issues I have? Honestly, when push comes to shove, I think I can say yes to both. I like the game, but I also have some serious problems with it. If this would be your first venture into the genre, this is probably a good place to start, as while it has its flaws, the lack of Fire Emblem's permadeath and the ability to make mistakes in most sections does make it easier to get a feel for the genre, even if it might not be the best game available. As for the rest of you, the decision will come down to whether the issues I've outlined would impede your enjoyment of an overall well-executed game. If you're interested, you can find a reliable copy over on Steam. That's all I have for this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. So that makes 2 console games I've reviewed in a row, and another game that I'm recommending despite noticeable issues. I thought I would end up branching out a bit more by covering this genre, but apparently not much has changed. I'll have to do something radically different before too long, but in the meantime I've got a franchise that I want to finish up. So, while I work on that, here's the orchestral version of the music I mentioned earlier. Enjoy.